No, Western astrology has absolutely no basis in the constellations, and through this series, I intend on establishing that understanding of what's going on. So, without further ado, I'm planning on filming this kind of in a live format, so I can just be, free flowing, have that stream of consciousness, so on and so forth, and really break things down. And I don't know, should I actually publicize this on the gram, let everybody know? Let's see. I'll put the timestamps in so you guys can skip this part. I don't want to make it public, so I like to do it in front of people because I get the energy from it. And it's nice to just feel the live, right? So yeah, without further ado, let's actually get into it. So with this being said, just the little understanding of the actual constellations and how they apply to certain energies in astrology, you need to understand that Western astrology has absolutely no basis in the stars. And with that being said, you can get a deeper understanding of yourself as well as your own actual constellations and the degrees if you really dive into the constellations. So, what I mean by that, I'll actually link a video that I made a long time ago that kind of explains the astrological calculations. So, if you go on my playlist explaining the astrological calculations, you'll get a deeper understanding of it. However, with that being said, you won't exactly get the full detail of all the constellations that are out there, of their energies, which is what I intend to accomplish in this course. So, when it comes to that, and it comes to kind of understanding the constellations, most people, when they talk about astrology, they understand that, I need to consult the stars. I need to understand the stars. I need to experience this vibration of actually dabbling with the stars. And the funny thing about that is people don't necessarily gravitate towards that. They don't necessarily gravitate towards that understanding, that newspaper style of astrology. And the funny thing about that is because Western astrology is not based in the actual star calculations whatsoever. It's based in the house systems, which contain the 88 constellations, right? So when we understand that, when we experience that, when we touch on that just brief little topic of dabbling in the constellations, you get a much wider expansion, you get a much wider understanding, you get a much wider experience of what these constellations actually have to offer, right? Because instead of 12, you have 88. And then when you go deeper, you understand that some of these actual constellations have a much larger experience, a much larger capacity within them, meaning that they have more than, like 8 stars or more in the actual space, right? So, with that being said, you'll get a kind of an inkling that there's much more to it when you actually dive into the constellations. And to give you a interpretation or a brief understanding of what that actually means, you'll notice that these actual constellations are the one that we're specifically talking about today for example purposes has 63 different stars in it. So when it comes to diving into degrees, diving into decans, and really diving into an understanding of what's actually going on within this space, you'll get an understanding that people don't really even know the half of what astrology actually has to offer, and that no one really talks about the actual constellations because they're so focused on just what's going on within, what's going on without, what is actually happening in that space. And it's kind of a funny thing when you really dive deeper into it because you're like, wow, I thought I knew it, but I didn't. And there are kind of like checks and balances within that actual space of really diving into the constellations, diving into that understanding because you'll recognize that there is a rhyme and a reason to why people actually focusing on the house systems or the 30-degree spaces in the sky rather than the individual constellations. And the reason for that is, you know, all of the planets are a lot more like stars. I know we can't exactly see that within our own space, within our own experience, within our own understanding of what it actually has to offer, but they operate energetically speaking much more like stars until we reach the moon, which is where the constellations actually have much more of an influence or an effect because the moon's influence in itself is to reflect light. So when the sun isn't on the moon from our ecliptic or our perspective as much, what stars are influencing it? And this is where we get deeper into understanding how, say, someone can have many different signs many different, or I should say, the similar signs and the similar, you know, celestial makeup, but then they're completely different because there's a different spirit actually driving that energy. There's a different spirit driving that person, actually pushing them towards different goals, different influences, different understandings of what's actually going on. So it's kind of a funny thing when when that type of stuff happens, because when we get into the constellations, this is where the answer happens. This is where we get an understanding. Now, a little bit more of the introduction with the constellations, you get an understanding of how powerful these things are, of how important these things are. And when it comes to that, this is probably the only live where I'll actually do a breakdown of these, like kind of like the rhyme or reason of why you need to know the constellations. And then we'll get into more of the specifics in terms of like, what is Andromeda or whatever is the specific constellation that we're talking about. So, with that being said, we can we covered the constellations, we covered why, we covered how astrology doesn't actually utilize them and how it's quote unquote misaligned. But when we get deeper into it, we can begin to touch on how the moon applies to it, kind of how degrees apply to it, and then how numerology apply to it, right? So we touched on the moon. A little bit more on the moon is that it doesn't necessarily give you the deepest understanding of the moon sign itself, which is why the constellations are more important. Meaning that when I was using that twin reference earlier, you need to get an understanding that the constellations give you a much deeper understanding of your own moon sign and the actual influence on you. And they give you a much more specific understanding of who you are and how that actually applies in this space, right? So when it comes to the moon and we dive into the degrees, which is how you find the specific constellation of your moon sign, once again, check out my chart calculations playlist to get a deeper understanding of it. I'll link it below. Then you can really dive into who you are and get a closer understanding without actually going into something like the Akashic records to experience the spiritual space of where you came from and how you incarnated as a spirit, right? So, with that being said, and actually using degrees of your own individual moon sign, you can get a deeper understanding of degrees as that is it of a jump off point, right? Because when we kind of talk about that and we dive into things like degree theory, one of my biggest disagreements with degree theory is that people look at it like they look at it like kind of what I forget the name of the person who actually came up with it, but they forget the name of or no, I forget the name, but they forget the actual reason why they did it, right? Like they don't look at it like objectively from their own space, which is if you know anybody that really like dives into degree theory, they'll be like, oh, 13, that's an Aries degree, completely disregarding numerology. But if you apply numerology to a specific degree, as well as understanding the constellations that actually apply to that degree, you get a much deeper understanding of what is going on, right? So when it comes to that, to really like, you need to you need to expand your understanding of that. You need to learn more about the constellations, and you need to just kind of think critically on your own accord of how that actually applies to yourself, right? So when we think about that, and we think about the actual constellations, they give a deeper understanding of the celestial oceans, right? And the celestial oceans, or the 30-degree spaces in the sky, which are the houses, are what contains the constellations. So then what are the constellations, right? The constellations are the individual waves. So if we have a degree that lines up with a specific star and a specific constellation, then you can really get a deeper understanding of what that wave is at that point in time and get a more important influence, or a more important, what should I say, I guess you could say, understanding, or some may say overstanding of what's going on in the actual space of the sky. Then you can really dive into what it means to actually experience that degree or understand that degree and feel what that degree actually means within your current time. Because the thing about the constellations and the stars and the experience within that space is that they shift, they move. They don't move fast, they don't move far, but they move 1 degree every 72 years, right? So, kind of with this opening rant or this opening dissertation on the constellations and fixed stars, you can kind of get a bit of footing. If you want more of a clear understanding, once again, I'll link the chart calculations playlist down below in this actual live. But without further ado, let's start talking about Andromeda. So, for those of you that don't know, Andromeda is the cage woman in the sky. In my notes over here, you can kind of see like a little picture, a little doodle that I drew with Andromeda being the cage woman, as well as all of the individual stars and calculations that are in this space and how we'll kind of be going over it, right? So, based off my notes, we will be talking about Andromeda. We'll be telling the story. We'll be talking about it from an astrological perspective. And then we will be going into the stars, right? We'll be going into how many stars. As I mentioned earlier, there's 63 stars in the constellation. And then if you actually look and count the stars that one would consider to be within like the body as well as the chains of Andromeda, you get 27, which is going to be a jump off point into the actual correlation of how she became the chained woman and the restrictions, aka Saturn, of how that applied, right? So with that being said, the story of Andromeda and how it goes is she is the daughter of the celestial kingdom. She is the daughter of that space. She's the daughter of that experience. She is the daughter of the celestial kingdom known as Ethiopia. It's not spelled the same way as the country in today's day and age, but it is, it has the A, right? And I think I don't know, this is like an Elon Musk quote, but like how he pronounced like how he like named that one son like X like AE like 12 or whatever the thing. I think the AE like before he said X was it's pronounced like Ash or something. So I'm not totally sure, but you can quote the internet on the future and the fact checkers or whatever. But it may be pronounced like Ashthiopia or something like that. So I'm not quite sure what that celestial kingdom is pronounced as, but I think that origin of lettering comes from like a Greco like Latin type of thing. Now, with that being said, basically how it goes is Andromeda is the daughter of Cassiopeia, the queen of Ethiopia, ironically named, and the king or the father of Andromeda is Cepheus, right? Now, the story more so starts with the theology or the origins of Cassiopeia, which is the queen of the celestial kingdom, and she is positioned as a woman sitting in a chair, admiring herself. She has a mirror. She's admiring her own beauty. It's a very like sun Venusian type influence on that space. And basically, her entire deal or influence is correlated to royalty as well as vanity, like looking too deeply into oneself. So when we kind of look at that energy and we look at that experience of what it means, you really need to like comprehend how long and how frequently these constellations actually go through this experience, right? They do it so frequently, so often, for so long that it becomes its own frequency and vibration and ripples through kind of like the universe in that way, shape, or form, which is why they have numerous stars or numerous chakras that influence, all of us and kind of like these lower octave experiences in these lower dimensions, right? So when we look at that, when we think about that, and when we experience these energies, you can recognize how Cassiopeia, create a huge ripple in the celestial ocean, which is not the constellations, but the house systems. So with that, oh man, I just realized I need a pen. Damn it. 1 second, I'll be back. Sorry. I wrote little sections in my notes to prepare for actually writing the timestamps because in my past live experience, when I didn't write it, it was it was a whole thing. So just gotta write that down real quick. I think I started talking about Andromeda around 10 minutes ish. Probably started at 14 minutes to 15. All right, cut that part out. Okay, cool. So yeah, so when you think about the actual ocean of just like that space, Andromeda actually occupies between 8 degrees of Aries, kind of leading into roughly 20, 21 degrees of Taurus. But with that being said, going back to Cassiopeia, when it comes to her having that large influence on the actual, just like, area space in general, don't quote me on what actual signs or what houses that Cassiopeia occupies. I don't know off the top of my head. But when you control like that much space in the celestial atmosphere, that's a whole thing, like that's a notable experience. That's a notable influence. That's a notable frequency that is occupied, right? So when it comes to that, and when you kind of dabble in experiencing something like that, it's a notable thing. Other constellations are going to notice. Other constellations are going to feel your waves of that actual space splashing up on it. And in this case, who noticed those waves and who got antagonized was Cetus, the sea monster, which is also contained in that like Aries, kind of like Pisces space. And it basically rides through the river Eridanus, which is one of the other constellations in that. Well, Eridanus kind of runs all the way through like Pisces, all the way through Taurus. But basically, Cetus is the sea monster that occupies that space. And how the story goes is some oracles and some other energies that, notice this antagonization of the kingdom were trying to figure out how to get rid of it and like comfort that situation and deal with that situation and, handle their situation. So once Cepheus kind of got the word and was talking to his oracles about this thing of like what to do and how to sort of save his kingdom from, you know, the sea monster basically antagonizing the entire kingdom, he got word that he was going to have to make a sacrifice, a very detrimental sacrifice that would actually satisfy the energy of this, monster. And unfortunately, he is his wife wasn't the one he could sacrifice. So he had to sacrifice something that was more pure, something more, jovial, something more childlike, something more innocent. And unfortunately, it came down to his daughter, which is the constellation that we're talking about right now, which is Andromeda. And unfortunately, what happened is this is the situation that led to the Andromeda that we know today, where she became the chained woman that was offered up to the sea monster Cetus to basically pay for the penance and or sins of his wife, which I am sure he considered wanting to sacrifice, being that she was the one that was too vain, couldn't get her in check. Shouts out to the red pill community, I guess, for being like, yeah, even a king couldn't do it in the celestial space. This woman was out of control, being too vain. Look at her; she still got the, the mirror on her today, being vain and dabbling in vanity. But when you're royalty, you get caught up by these things. Watch Gossip Girl. It's entire season, like there's 6 seasons dedicated to that energy of vanity. But when you expand a little deeper and you kind of dive a little further in terms of what's offered about that, you'll recognize that it was a very unfortunate situation. And Andromeda is now chained up still to this day when you are a, celestial being in the star being offered for the safety of that entire kingdom, right? But briefly back to Cassiopeia, if like we're down here doing this, the constellations and the stars started it, so it's kind of like you get onto some energy. You can get very sidetracked into these things in terms of like who created it, but like if you're doing it at the level of a constellation, it's pretty heavy, man. You influence the whole generations of beings that live in lower vessels below you, so tough situation. But when it comes back to Andromeda, unfortunately, she was chained up. She was the one that is, stuck paying the penance of her mother's actual experience, right? So, with that being said, Andromeda leads to a lot of different influences. That's the story. That's kind of what happened. And segueing into the astrological interpretation of it, Andromeda was a very pure, a very innocent, a very powerful being, I might add. However, she wasn't exactly the most lucky, right? Which is why a lot of ancient astrologers correlate her to a Venusian energy, but more so Venus and Virgo, a Venusian energy that's at its detriment. And when you kind of look at the Venusian energy that's at its detriment, you begin to recognize how awesome it could be or how awesome it has been, but not necessarily how powerful it became, right? So when we talk about that kind of like Venus and Virgo energy, it's kind of hard to not bring Saturn when we think about the chains and we think about the restrictions of this actual space. So when talking about Andromeda, the Andromedan energy is a sweet girl, a sweet I think she was kind of chained around like equivalent age 15. She's a celestial body, so it's hard to say. But when we think about Andromeda and what she could have done or what she could have became, we'll never know. She's chained up. That's what's going to happen. But leading up to that is where that Venusian energy was ascertained, right? Once again, this is all the way from Ptolemy, which is one of the last kind of like major recognized astrologers that actually looked at the stars, right? And looked at the fixed stars and understood the connections and how they actually influence, right? So when it comes to experiencing that and really understanding what Andromeda has to offer, you need to understand that there's a lot of beauty, there's a lot of hesitation. And what kind of comes to mind, especially when I was doing my research on this actual constellation, was she's the one correlated to generational curses, right? So it comes from hesitation, worry energy, um, having responsibility at a young age, dealing with these problems, and basically being stuck and chained up by your own ideas that came from your parents at the end of the day, right? So it's kind of like a correlation of hesitation as well as you not necessarily being the causation, but carrying out those responsibilities that those before you came based off their own stupid situations, right? Because to sum up, the story of Andromeda, she was sacrificed because a sea monster was mad at her mom for being a vain, stupid, annoying person and creating that ripple throughout the celestial space. And basically the sea monster felt left out, and now Andromeda's like, damn, like I gotta pay this. Come on, man. So it's not necessarily like she's angry, but once we get into the actual specific stars that are within this space, yeah, we could see how that star may be angry, right? So when it comes to Andromeda, her kind of like natural energy before like the chains are a lot of purity, a lot of virtue, a lot of innocence, right? Those who have I guess like influence of Andromeda. I actually know someone that is named Andromeda. I didn't know that because they always went by Andy. But that was wild to think about because then when I thought about her whole life, I was like, damn, like her parents really did her dirty. Because she actually like lived out the situation similar to Andromeda, where it was like pure intentions, very virtuous, but always held back by life and the hesitations and the experience of that actual space, right? So when it comes to kind of like dabbling in the story of Andromeda and what she has to offer in terms of influence, like people are very pure, they're very virtuous, but their virtues may not be their own. Their virtues may not be their own experience. Their virtues may not be everything that the world has to offer, right? Because it comes from a space of generational trauma, like literally, like, and it was close generational trauma too. It was her parents literally offering up as a sacrifice. So when it comes to that and it comes to being like kind of like forced to uphold that energy, it's a problem. It's not something that you necessarily want to experience. It's not something that you want to carry out. And the thing about Andromeda, especially when we start getting into these specific stars, is she has a lot to offer and can't do it, right? So when we think about that and we actually apply it to our own individual experiences, think about some of the expectations that a lot of the, I guess, parents of the millennials and Gen Z are going through, right? They were the last generation to say, hey, college is the only way you can actually make money in this world. College is the only way you can actually make, a living or learn something or be successful and actually have status in our society, right? And what a lot of the millennial and Gen Z, or I should say our generation, personally, I'm on the cusp, is that we learned and felt a lot of power about that philosophy, right? And to make it more specific, like a lot of that generation is Pluto and Sagittarius, and as well as having a lot of their generational planets being between Sagittarius and Aquarius, being very indifferent, being very innovative, using like social networks and all that stuff, but also recognizing that you don't necessarily need to gain power from some type of external philosophy or external experience or external understanding of what's going on, right? So when it comes to that, like our kind of like generation's Andromedan experience is feeling like we have to go to college. A lot of people going, even though they don't want to, just because they feel like they have to, even though they know it's not working, although the tides are kind of shifting now. And then recognizing that you can gain power, you can gain knowledge, you can gain your own individuality from just learning on your own. Like we have the internet, like the only actual point and purpose of going to some type of mentor adjacent, institution that's going to teach you something is to gain the knowledge of a very specific career field that will actually make you that money. But nowadays, a lot of people are like, retaliating in a way that's not necessarily beneficial by being, undecided for 3 years, or they are in a space of like, just going for something that they don't like when in reality, that's not the world nowadays. It's not the tools you have to offer. Like they're forcing this ideology on people because that's all they know. And the reality is like kind of what Andromeda is teaching us is that you can sometimes your parents can be wrong. Sometimes your parents can not benefit you in a way, you know? And if you actually look at all of these descriptions of the fixed stars and the constellations, like most of them came from 2000 years ago where it was all war, mongering, blah, 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 blah. Everybody's like fighting, we're going to let God decide the fate and then two dudes have to duel. So it's a very like aggressive interpretation of the stars, which is why I wanted to apply in more of a modern understanding where it's like parents wanted to force their children to do something that they thought was right for them, but they're not living in like the youth. They're not living in this space. So I would say it's a much less harsh actual experience compared to what Andromeda went through. But that is a similar, example to kind of spark the influence and the ideas of what it may have felt like since it's so real for many of you, right? You know, because you didn't want to do it. You know damn well Andromeda didn't want to get chained up to sacrifice herself to a sea monster. That's terrible. She's still up there waiting on that sea monster to get her today. It might eventually, but I feel like Draco, the World Eater, we'll get to that because I'm doing it in alphabetical order. In terms of like talking about the stars, will kind of eat the world much sooner. But anyways, that's a story for another time. But when it comes back to Andromeda, Andromeda is like it kind of deals with like living a sweet life, enjoying in our world, enjoying like high school, having that carefree. You got a job, you got a car, you're scheming on the shorties for the first time, or you got your first boyfriend for the first time, whatever. But you get caught up and swept up by having to do something that you don't necessarily want to do and carrying the weight and the risk. And in our day and age, that weight and the risk based off that specific example is student debt, which is a heavy weight that kind of lasts like a lifetime for some people. If you want to talk shit about it, that's just listen to all of just listen to all of Kanye's early albums before he went crazy, or you know, uh, or as he likes to say, we're just like, I'm not right, or am I just not right now? And maybe people will agree with the way the world's going, they probably will, but that's the more localized example of how you can actually experience Andromeda, right? Feeling so much pressure from a parental figure to push you towards something that you don't want to do that's for the quote unquote greatest good, when in reality, maybe it's not the greatest good for you. But hey, that's kind of what it leads to in terms of how most people experience the Andromedan energy, which for those who kind of have like like if you want to get more localized in terms of your example, I don't know if you know your houses for those who are watching, but drop the house, you have like kind of that like Aries Taurus cuspin, but that is the space of where you experience that sense of hesitation, even though you thought of something that would be like, oh, that's so fun, that's so beautiful, it's so lighthearted, but you experience hesitation in some way, shape, or form because you feel held up in terms of like, oh, it's a great idea, but I shouldn't. And then you kind of live in that space of where you just feel paralyzed by a certain emotion that you lock into in terms of like wanting to do something, but then nah, because you care about like what I guess the rules that you don't even agree with society is holding you back from, right? So when it comes to that, that's basically like Andromeda. That's basically the energy of it, where you feel like you should, and it was a great idea when you were doing it, but then you didn't necessarily ride that wave of momentum and inspiration when having to do something. And then that experience itself became quite lackluster in terms of not doing something. On a greater scale, like I mentioned, it's generational curses. So feeling like maybe you're the first one going to college in your like entire bloodline of higher education, and or you're the first millionaire in your entire bloodline, but there's a lot of like uphill battles and uphill generational traumas to cut through and actually go through in terms of unwinding that, right? And it's kind of it's a powerful thing to go through because you got to shake off chains that have been on your entire bloodline spirit, and you got to cut that. That's a whole lot of work, and you're like that one rare black sheep that's supposed to save everyone. It's a whole thing. But anyways, that is pretty much the energy of Andromeda in terms of how it actually influences you, right? So if it would get like more specific, like kind of what I was talking about in terms of how you actually apply the constellations to your birth chart, which would be specifically like the moon, then that is where you get into it. So like someone who has like an Andromeda moon, depending on the star, which is what we're going to get into, they are likely to be quite virtuous, quite jovial, quite happy, quite powerful, but they hold back due to their own fears, right? And that's kind of like their whole gumption, where it's like they're supposed to overcome those internal boundaries that they place on themselves due to all of the thoughts of like, all their ancestors and their bloodline saying, no, don't do that. Yet it kind of brings up the topic of where people say, oh, Jesus, take the wheel. And then someone goes, Jesus didn't know how to drive. So it's like dealing with all the worries and all the thoughts like bottled up inside you from your ancestors, holding you back from something that you want to do when you have all these ideas and all this chatter from people that don't even have a concept of how society or the language or the experience operates within your own space and time, right? So with that being said, let's kind of like segue into the stars and really like dive into the specifics, right? So when I do fixed star readings or I teach people how to kind of like experience and understand the fixed stars, what I do is normally it's like if the star is actually in your sky, like go find it, go focus on it, go basically like look at it, stare at it, do the equivalent of sun gazing at that star. Blink, close your eyes, and then like meditate, right? So you can kind of like connect with that star, get the experience of it, and experience the information you need necessary to kind of like do a reading or understand the energy or influence, whatever you got to do, right? The next step that I kind of lead people down to in terms of like non like psychic varieties, I guess if you want to call it, is utilizing like two sites. There's Constellation of Words, and then there is the Astrology King and his like specific fixed stars list. So when you go on that, some like a lot of the fixed stars are listed. A lot of information you can get on it. They give information like this is correlated to Venus, so this is correlated to Mars's influence, and so on and so forth, right? So and like you'll remember I mentioned that Andromeda is very equivalent to a Venus and Virgo star. So when you go deeper into that, and there are stars that aren't explained, my personal method is to apply it to us, right? Because it's influencing us in our realm. Usually, when you look up a constellation, you'll be able to get like a general like overview. So you go, okay, this is a very, for Andromeda's case, this is a very Venus and Virgo star, right? But it's humanoid. So what do? We apply the astrological chakras to that space. So if you don't know the astrological chakras, but you know your birth chart, it's basically the same thing, but layered out through the body. So for example, one of the main stars in Andromeda is Mirach. Mirach is on the hip. Specifically, it's on Andromeda's right side, but from our perspective, it is the left. Now, with Andromeda, with Mirach being on the right side of the hip, we're going to take that Andromedan influence that we know, but it's the hip. So, what is the hip? The hip is basically the cusp of the seventh and eighth house, right? So, it's a deep connection in your relationships, your one on one partnerships, so on and so forth. And when we think about the right side, spiritual right is righteous. It's the like what people feel like is the right thing by society, right? So if you see somebody that's like, you know, in a car crash on the side of the road, no ambulance is there, you call and make sure that like the ambulance is there, right? So that's like kind of that righteous energy of doing that right thing and feeling what you should do and what makes you feel good in the soul and what kind of like intuitive influences you have, right? So when it kind of comes into that space, like Maroc is a very righteous understanding of doing right by I don't know, there's like two perspectives. Well, now I'll get into perspectives when I actually talk about Maroc, but basically what you would do is you would basically kind of go through your astrological mathematical like checklist or whatever, or your astrological PEMDAS and go, okay, constellations influence, seventh and eighth house. How would that general influence apply from a seventh and eighth house perspective? And then when you kind of like write that down, you start jotting it, you get a mind map or whatever, you can get a deeper understanding of that star specifically without there actually being any literature on it. You can create your own influence, which is, I would go into much more detail if I actually do a reading, but that's how I specifically do it if I can't get a psychic connection to the star. There's no information on the interwebs and I actually like have to figure it out on my own in terms of explaining what is going on specifically with that star, right? So, for example, that is pretty much that's pretty much it in regards to the stars and how you would get a basic understanding. I'm going to teach it in much more detail in my school, which is also linked in the description, where I teach a lot of people about astrology. Got like 9 courses on there. It's a community where everybody that's into astrology can meet, so on and so forth. But yeah, so basically, when we get a little deeper and we talk more about the stars, in the actual Andromeda constellation, there are 63 total stars. Like I mentioned before, a lot of them are not actually in the constellational space. Not a lot of them are really, aware of what's going on. Not a lot of them are, I would even consider applied to it, but that's how the internet applies to it. So we're just going to kind of go with it. But how I interpreted it, and when I actually did it on the body of Andromeda, there are specifically 27 stars, right? And I drew a little Saturn symbol on the chain to symbolize the Saturnian restriction because I don't like, I see Venus and Virgo, like how Ptolemy mentioned it, but I don't necessarily, like, I see more of a Saturnian thing, especially when the 27 stars jumped out because that's how many I counted when we were actually doing it, right? So when it comes to that, and there is some type of Saturnian influence on the actual stars, that's where you get like the chains. Those are the chains of Andromeda holding it back in some way, shape, or form. And those are the, if we remember from the influential standpoint that I mentioned, the logic, the reasoning, and the hesitation that comes from the mental capacity that is typically on Andromeda, right? So when it comes to that space and it comes to that understanding, it really creates I would say, a web of understanding how Andromeda's influence applies, right? Excuse me. So when it comes to that, there are 27 stars that hold it back. There are, once again, 63 stars in the total constellation consideration. But then when it comes to the fixed stars and the spectral classes of how people consider Andromeda and use the fixed stars to calculate like what's going on in the sky, there are 9 fixed stars. So what do all of these stars have in common, or what do all of these numbers have in common when we touch on the numerological aspect? 6 plus 3, 9. 27, 9. 9 just itself, 9 is the number of completion, right? So if we think about the experience and the influence from Andromeda's perspective, getting over that energy and getting over that influential energy that Andromeda has of like wanting to do something, being very pure about that idea, and then getting chained up by hesitation. If we look at all these nines, that 9 would tell us that the energy of this space is all about getting over that hesitation, getting over creating those roadblocks within yourself. The Andromedan influence in its most basic form is creating roadblocks for yourself. And then you can take it higher or lower based off the experience and the actual influence of that star, right? It goes all the way up to generational curses and being worried about what other people think about you and what other people's opinions have in your life and your ancestors that aren't even alive right now, that haven't even moved on from this space, that are too lazy and need to reincarnate 1,000 different times to actually get a lesson that you could learn for them so that they don't have to do it. That is the energy of Andromeda. So its entire influence from a pure virtuistic standpoint is to get you over that space of hesitation, which is a very funny thing in terms of what it actually offers, right? So with that being said, and kind of talking about Andromeda and what's going on, let's go over the individual stars. So basically, the individual stars that we have and that we will be going over is we have Alpheratz. Once again, I'm going over the specific 9 that are considered to be the quote unquote fixed stars of Andromeda. So I'm going over Alpheratz, Téng Shé, Téng Jiù, Kuí Sù, Kuí Sù C, and Kuí Sù Liu. Then Mirach, Titawin. That was the one that made me think of a lot of Star Wars stuff. And then Almach, right? So these are the 9 specific stars that kind of create like more of that body or more of that like physical figure in terms of Andromeda, right? So starting at Alpheratz, Alpheratz kind of like sits above the head. You can see it like, where is it? Right here. This is Alpheratz. Alpheratz is a very interesting star. It has kind of a Venusian as well as Jupiterian influence. I sort of see it as like the, that sweet, like little girl that wasn't before she was chained up. Whatchamacallit? Yeah. Oh yeah, I appreciate that. I actually forgot to mention that Andromeda is it's what's the word? It's in between Algol and Shíjiǔ. So basically, like if you looked at the Andromedan constellation, Algol would kind of like be over here, and then Shíjiǔ and Pegasus would be like up here. So yeah, shout out to that. Appreciate it. So when we talk about Alpheratz, Alpheratz I sort of see as kind of like that daydreaming energy from that sweet little girl that was like, oh well, I'm chained up, might as well have a good time and daydream and not be here, right? What every spiritual person kind of thinks they would do if they ever go to prison, where they're just like, I'm just going to meditate and astral project out of it. They can't catch me. Then it's like, hey, well, you manifested yourself in a mental prison anyway to teach yourself how to get out of a mental prison. So that's the whole thing in itself. But anyways, Alpheratz is a pretty inspirational star. It can get carried away, but I also see Alpheratz as I don't know, it's kind of like a distracting. So I sort of see its influence as it's like, okay, Andromeda's chained up. You've kind of hit that roadblock. You've had that inspiring idea. Now you're hitting the hesitation. And then now you have Alpheratz, which is the daydream of where it's like, oh, I'm just going to do nice things to distract myself and not face the problem or the roadblock that's right in front of me, So Alpheratz is it's a good star. It's a benevolent star overall, but it's a benevolent star in terms of distraction. Like it won't necessarily direct you towards the most powerful, highest good for yourself. It'll take you on a lot of good situations where you can experience things, you can have fun, you can go eat your cake, you can feel like you can have your cake and eat it too. But it's basically kind of like a reprieve, right? It's a mental, you know, break from whatever you're dealing with or whatever you're avoiding. So that's kind of like the energy of Alpheratz in a way. Like it's good, it'll give you a good daydream, but it's sort of like you're like, I have a snow day and I'm off of school and I don't want to go to school even though I'm gonna have school all week. But on this snow day, I'm going to sit home and watch movies and act like nothing's ever going to happen, right? Like that's the energy of Alpheratz at the end of the day. It's a very like it's a good star, but if you don't face what you have going on and you kind of act like a Sagittarius moon your entire existence, it's not necessarily the best opportunity for you to really like grow and expand, right? Now we move on to the next star, which is Téng Shé, or yeah, Téng Shé. Did I read that right? Which is Téng Jiù. It's the left chain of Andromeda. So, and it's also at 18 degrees and 30 minutes of Aries, right? So Téng Jiù is a like it's an okay star, but it's kind of touching on that energy of generational curse, right? So when we go back and we actually explain the understanding of what that actually applies, it's that unknown feeling, it's that unknown idea of what's holding you back. It's that unknown experience of you're just like, wow, I don't know necessarily why I'm in this space of feeling like, hey, I want to do this, but I don't feel like I exactly can, and I don't know why. And it could even go deep as to being uncertain about like what subconscious mechanisms or what subconscious experiences are holding you back. But it's not necessarily like the worst star, even though it kind of sounds like it up front, right? Because there's like a good and a bad to each star, right? So, for example, like touching back on Alpheratz a little bit, like Alpheratz gives the person like the tool to be like, say, you're dealing with like an 8-year-old kid whose mom died. You would be perfect to distract that person from them and kind of like give them that little reprieve and like take them to, the petting zoo or like whatever you have going on to help them get over that. When it comes to like Téng Shé is really great at if they overcome their own internal struggles and their own subconscious boundaries, what's holding them back, they are really, really good at figuring out how to expand beyond other people's subconscious boundaries and really target specifically what is the unforeseen chain that is holding them back. It's like it's a good star, it's all right, but at the end of the day, they have a lot to overcome in terms of growing beyond like what's going on in their own space. You know what I'm saying? Now, when we get to the next star, which is what should I call it? Which is Tiān Jiù. I think I want to look up the actual astrologer that actually named these way back when because I feel like this is like probably like fourth century China that did it, just based on the names. But Tiān Jiù is the left bicep. So when it comes to the left bicep, it's kind of like around the elbow. This kind of deals with more like the third house energies. So it's fine. Like you're basically like spending like the most of your life with this influence. Like if you ever angle it, which is like an Aries season, like you're basically chasing your tail in terms of what's holding you back, right? So when we think about the Aries energy, the Aries needs to be the leader. So this kind of brings up that square of an Aries ascendant where they have like, they want to be the leader and they don't recognize that they find a lot of comfort. They find a lot of home. They find a lot of like, with being the actual like leader of the group, right? So when they have nothing to pioneer or nothing to lead, they're kind of left like waggling their tail, just being, like Zuko, like wondering where the source of his fire is coming from. You know what I'm saying? Where it's like, like I'm trying to like start something, I'm trying to get it rolling, but they're kind of like, they're sort of like a car that just won't start. They don't realize that they need a new battery just yet, right? Like that's like the typical energy of this star. It's not like, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it kind of deals with a lot of the source of energy or the source of motivation behind someone's ideas and their mentality, right? It's dealing with uncovering that and expanding that and understanding that, which is something that they don't necessarily, it's not something that they won't grow with or won't figure out, but a lot of these like detrimental battles is kind of like a dog chasing its tail for a long time until they figure it out. But if they do, then they kind of find that source of energy again, and then they basically attract a lot of people or a lot of like spirits that are going through the same experience and the same understanding without like the knowledge or way to get out of it, right? So they attract a lot of that, and then they figure out how to like teach them and grow. And that's kind of like a consistent theme in terms of what's going on with this star, right? And once again, at this current date and time, that would be found at 20 degrees and 45 minutes of Aries, right? So one of the things I think I didn't mention in like my general like dissertation on the fixed stars and what was going on with them was that the fixed stars move 0.838 minutes every year, right? Or 1 degree every 72 years. So a lot of the fixed star calculations on the internet are listed at either 1900, like 1900, 2000, or 2050, right? Which is showing you how the fixed stars move every so on and so forth. But the specific degrees that I'm listing are for roughly like 2024 leading into 2025. So with that being said, that was Tiān Jiù, which is the left bicep of the Andromeda constellation. And then the next one, which is at 20 degrees and 55 minutes of Andromeda, is Kuí Sù, which is the right elbow, right? So the right elbow it's a similar influence, but from a very different perspective of where you feel like you need to like it's like you're born knowing you have to help people understand their subconscious blockages and their subconscious boundaries in terms of what's going on. And oh yeah, thanks for letting me know because I was like wondering this whole time if the audio was working, and I was like, I didn't want to be like fuck, you know what I'm saying? But yeah. So yeah, with that being said, the next one is whatchamacallit. It's yeah, like I said, it's Kuí Sù. It's the right bicep of the Andromeda constellation. And basically, what it does is it kind of gives you the connection of it's designed to show you the connection of your mentality as well as like what's holding you back, right? So it's like a little bit different than Tiān Jiù, which is like the incarnation of someone who has to kind of like chase their tail in terms of figuring out like why they're held back in some way, shape, or form. But this one consciously knows they're held back. And the thing about knowing is you don't necessarily feel that sense of urgency to accomplish it sometimes, especially from Andromeda. So you're kind of like that, like it may start out as that, like I don't want to say disingenuous or disinterested and like lack of understanding, but it's like a lot of them, it's like they know what they need to do and yet they don't do it, right? So, but it's a little bit deeper than procrastination. It like has that sense of feeling like of I don't know, it's kind of like a lot of like, millennials nowadays that are just like, "Ugh, I'm never going to get out of credit. Like, they're never going to get out. They feel like they're never going to get out of credit card debt. So they continuously pay their minimum payment. And they just kind of like, we're like, well, I got hundreds of thousands of dollars in student debt. I got, not me personally, but like, they're like, they got like, it's like, I don't even want to say it. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't even want to like express it out because I don't want to even have that like energy like on me, but you get the concept of where they're like, they feel like they're never going to get out of like some type of situation. So they keep doing the bare minimum to like keep day. And yet they don't necessarily go out and, relieve themselves of it. So Kuí Sù is being that's like, hey, I see it. I know what's going on. This is what I'm experiencing. Do I want to get out of it? Do I want to deal with it? Nah, not really. They're just kind of like comfortable with. They love creating comfort in their own hell. They don't want to build a heaven. But then again, like I mentioned, there's two sides to every. There's many vibrations to every experience, and usually the higher vibration is for most of these stars is kind of like that social work energy of just like getting to it. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, dang, I keep forgetting to write down the timestamps. I gotta put it in later and also gonna make a better thumbnail, blah blah blah. But yeah, that's Kuí Sù. Now when we get to Kuí Sù is the right shoulder of the Andromeda constellation. And when we get to the right shoulder, it's a little bit different, right? Because it comes with the boundaries that are supporting the mentality, right? And this is like, it's basically, I don't know, it's a weird thing because it's not necessarily the internal shoulder, it's like the deltoid. So it's what lifts up the arm, right? Like what lifts up your basic touch, what lifts up your basic understanding, what lifts up your basic extraction of the world around you, right? It's like dealing with your basic senses. So when it comes to that energy of like what keeps your arm up, what keeps your shoulder in socket, what keeps your basic senses in order. It's I don't know, it's like a tough one to deal with because it's basically like I would say it's a dumber version of Kuí Sù air, where it's like I don't know, it's like that little kid that wants to like they know they shouldn't do something. They know they shouldn't like burn that ant with a magnifying glass, and they know they shouldn't like, you know, punch a hole through the wall when they're mad at their girlfriend or whatever, but they do it anyway, you know? So it's kind of like that like dumb it's kind of like that dumb you should have known better and you do know better, but you're sort of doomed to like a lower understanding of it. Like it's not really the best star to have in your chart. Like everybody has these stars in their chart, but like if you have a specific prominence of it, it's like you're basically, you know, it's kind of like that Uncle Iroh quote where it's just like you're moving too fast for wisdom to catch up with you, and you know that, and you don't do it anyway, and you just decide to stay at the level of like maintaining reading at a third grade level. And you know, on the positive end, you're going to be a smart person that's kind of like, yeah, it's very face palmy energy. But if you're a smart person, like you'll end up just kind of like being like a counselor at a boys and girls club. It's kind of like doom telling people the most basic things, right? It's very like gym teacher energy, you know, of where it's like you could do more, you got a lot of time on your hands, especially if you accomplish it on a higher level, and yet you don't. You know what I'm saying? Like that is the essential energy of Kuí Sù, you know, because it's like, cool, I see, you know, like that's like what the name sounds like. It's a whole thing. But yeah, everybody that just showed up, like the live for me. Like I said, I'm gonna post it, put the timestamps in, give a more deeper dissertation. I'm going to do these for all 88 constellations. I'm kind of treating this as a more of a long form breakdown of what's going on, and creating like the largest library of actually, you know, localized and modernized like fixed star content. And then I'm going to like I'm kind of treating this as like research to basically make like more like lively like trending audio pictures and actually visualizing telling the story under like 3 minutes, you know. So I actually had it was one of my goals for this astrological year, and then I pretty much like yeah, like I started it, but then it was a lot of work because I had to do research. So I was gonna break it up and basically like research, create a more vibrant version, and then like, you know, make that like short. You know what I'm saying? So that's pretty much what's going on. Now, the next star that we're actually going into is Kuí Sù, Kuí Sù Liu, which is once again all these like Kuí Sù is spelled Kui, then 57, 50, so and then it's Su, and then this one is Liu, which I want to. I'm assuming that's Chinese. I want to translate it from it. It sounds like I feel like it would be Cantonese rather than Mandarin, but you know I never studied that. I studied German. Anyways, this one is an interesting one because it is the actual throat of the Andromeda constellation. So when it comes to the throat of the Andromeda constellation, this is the energy of calling out. Like this is annoying because it's like all of your like it's either you psychoanalyze yourself or you're psychoanalyzing everybody else from a held back space, right? So it's like you're dissecting your own subconscious and unconscious and not doing anything about it for a long time, at least you're procrastinating it, or you're dissecting everybody else's sub and unconscious, making immediate judgments, which is, you know, what Aries does. It's the baby. It does a lot of intuitive things. It does just, yeah, you know what I'm saying? Um, yeah. Oh, yeah, Beans. I got a lot of time. This is the astrological year. We're just barely in Scorpio season, so I got another 5 months of my astrological year. That's how I do my goals. But yeah. So it's like I did it for 2024, and then I was like, oh fuck, the astrological New Year's. Then I like rewrote it, you know. But yeah. So Kuí Sù Liu is the throat of Andromeda. It's actually represented by the pi symbol, so it's pi Andromeda. And like I said, it is basically procrastinating on your own things that are very obvious to you and you recognize it and you just spend more time doing the subconscious and unconscious recognition of what's going on within yourself, and you're very good at it. You're great at Dr. Philin, but what you're not good at doing is you're not good at going to Turnabout Ranch and actually becoming a better person or doing the internal work. And I don't know, it kind of really comes into play of like some of like my high ticket clients that I deal with, because a lot of people like get my custom guided meditations. And if you want to like try that out, I have one in my meditations playlist, which just takes you through all the astrological chakras. Basically, like it kind of this concept in itself formulated like how I do my high ticket offers, because I basically what I do is I give people like a guided meditation and tell them to do it almost every day for like 3 weeks, and I give them another one, and then in between that time while they're doing that, depending on like sometimes the first I don't give them like journaling prompts, but I give them a lot of journaling prompts to recognize like the patterns, because like if you don't recognize what you frequently see, you're not going to see your frequency, and you're not going to change anything because you're still vibrating at that frequency of experiencing that thing every day. Because at the end of the day, meditation is only a tool to uncover what you're going through, right? So basically, these Kuí Sù and a lot of these like basic stars are very similar to like kind of Sag moon energy. So it's like I don't know. It's like they basically just want to experience feelings and options, but they don't want to actually do anything about it. But when it comes to Aries, they have a very finite focus of what they're actually experiencing and going through. And specifically with Kuí Sù, is they don't recognize how to expand beyond what they're going through, right? So they don't want to do the work, they don't want to do these things, and they just kind of want to fart around with like their thumb up their butt and kind of just like they don't even want to feel good about it. You know what I'm saying? Like especially from the lower vibrational standpoint. But once again, when you get to the higher vibrational standpoint of what the star actually is, you recognize that they have a lot of power and a lot of opportunity to just start like calling people out, like just straight up like this is what you're doing, this is what you're procrastinating on, and they use that strength of all the time they spent procrastinating on their own shit to help like give people the gumption of like, oh, like sorry grandma, I gotta sit up straight, my bad, I ruined Thanksgiving. And it's like that type of energy. So that's how it can flip to a kind of a positive standpoint of them using that like Dr. Phil psychoanalytic energy to not only motivate people to get out of that procrastinative state or that procrastinating state, but to also grow and actually do like the necessary tools to remove those Andromedan chains from what's going on, right? Um, I'm gonna have better lighting for my future lives, but for now, I like the contrast. It makes my cheekbones pop. But yeah. Anyways, moving on to one of the famous stars, Mirach, which I have a lot of you know dealings with, to say the least. So when it comes to Mirach is a very interesting star. It's the right hip of Andromeda, and it is the kind of the seat of how Andromeda actually holds that energy within itself regarding kind of like what everybody went through, right? And just a reminder for everybody that kind of like just showed up, the entire purpose of this entire series that I'm doing is to show you how Western astrology, the astrology that most people in the West use, is not based in the constellations whatsoever. It's based in the house systems. However, the houses contain the constellations, so it's not a direct connection, but it's like a, if not, it's like a, if a chicken or the egg type thing. Although we know because the houses came first, then the constellations were attracted to that space, and now they are the waves within the celestial seas that are the individual signs that you think are based in constellations but aren't. And here are the constellations that we're talking about, and Andromeda takes up 8 degrees of Aries all the way through like 20 degrees of Taurus. So there you go. That's that lava energy. It's like, I'm excited, but I'm not going to do it quite yet. But anyways, Mirach is the right hip. It is at 0 degrees and 55 minutes of Taurus. And it is correlated to the Saturnian and Venusian energies. So it's like that energy of Andromeda that I think is more correlated to Andromeda rather than Ptolemy's understanding of Andromeda, which was, Mr. 2000 years ago said Venus and Virgo. I say more of a Venus and Saturn connection. And once again, watch live again on my connection to the number 9 and Saturn, because you'll see it. It was an interesting thing, and it deals with the 63 total stars, 27 total stars that I counted within the body, and then 9 fixed stars in that space, and that all equals 9, but it connects to Saturn. You'll see the breakdown if you watch it again. But yeah, anyways, when it comes to Mirach is, like I said, Saturn and Venus, right? So it's that like loving but restricted energy. It's that Papa taking you, telling you to do your chores, but he's not beating your ass, and he is encouraging you to, be a very responsible individual. So it's like it's kind of like that energy of like your parents like giving you chores, but then giving you an allowance, but then taking some of your allowance away to get you used to paying bills. Like it's like that type of thing of where it's like, hey, I got money in my pocket, but damn, I can't be a kid. The real world, you know how that goes. Can't get used to the fun. So that's kind of like what Mirach is when it comes to experiencing that from an Andromeda perspective, right? But what comes to mind is Mirach being at the cusp of the seventh and eighth house, or the seventh and eighth house chakra in Andromeda. And this brings back to the story of how Andromeda got in this position of where, you know, um, for lack of a better term, Andromeda's mom was a hoe. She was a vain ass hoe that kept looking at herself. It created a terrible rift in the celestial kingdom. And then now Cepheus, the father of that actual um, which we call of Andromeda, and the king of the celestial kingdom known as Ethiopia, was like, damn, the oracles are telling me that the sea monster is mad. I got to do something. I can't sacrifice my wife. She's the problem. She's tripping. And then now the oracles tell me I got to sacrifice my daughter. Damn, I got to do all this because I couldn't keep my wife in check. And since I couldn't keep my higher feminine natures in check in my kingdom, I have to get rid of my lower ones and try again. And now Andromeda's still chained up to this day, even though it's been eons probably. It's a tough battle in itself, right? So with that being the story, and Mirach being on the space of the seventh and eighth house of Andromeda, Andromeda is thinking deeply about the emotions that came from and that is stuck within her body from this relationship. That's Mirach in itself, right? So when it comes to Mirach's energy, the specific thing that it feels held back by is its deep connections to relationships. So anybody who has a strong connection to Mirach, that's why they have a lot of relationship boundaries, because they're specifically channeling the generational trauma of whatever's going on in their bloodline, and how being too loosey-goosey with their relationship boundaries bit them in the ass. So now they're carrying that out from all their ancestors, all the experience, and all the space of what's going on. That's Mirach. So that's why people who have a very strong Mirach energy are very careful with their relationships. They're very careful, right? They like to set their boundaries. They like to let people know, hey, man, you're not going to do this, this, and this when you experience it with me. And they are very quick to put their shell up, kind of like that Cancerian energy of what's going on. Sorry, I've been talking for a while. I need to hydrate. Damn, how late is it? But yeah, so Mirach is a very interesting thing. Once again, it's the right hip. So they're going to do things from a very righteous standpoint. They're going to be very rigorous. They're going to be very, restrictive in terms of like leeway when it comes to people crossing their boundaries. Everybody knew like alive. And it's kind of putting them in a space of deeper understanding in terms of, who they want around them, how they want them to be. When it comes to Mirach, like anybody who has a strong influence of Mirach in their chart is very likely in early years having a hard time with relationships, because like I don't necessarily want to say like they're born with self-respect, but they're born with boundaries, and eventually it'll like the boundaries that they create will be filled up and strengthened from that sense of self-respect. So Mirach is like a powerful star in that way, and it opens people up to that concept of boundaries, and they can teach a lot about relationship boundaries and how to respect people in relationships. But sometimes they can go too far with their boundaries. Sometimes they can open themselves up too wide. Sometimes, you're wild for that. Sometimes they can open themselves up a lot. Sometimes they can open themselves up a little. And sometimes they can expand their space from what it means to really have boundaries as a whole, right? And like eventually, from a high standpoint, it can really evolve into them attracting like it can evolve to them attracting like the necessary people into their life from strengthening their boundaries. Uh, Once we kind of get into the lower, it's either like basically any part of Andromeda that not chain that like isn't chained. You kind of get a little psychic with it, especially when it comes to the more airy sides of Andromeda, because Aries has that natural energy of being childlike and intuitive that they get to tap into that sub 7 year old like theta state of where it's like they're kind of like, oh, we're living in a dream, like we're just doing whatever, like this is what came in, this is what I'm feeling, this is the download I got, this is the data set I got. So Mirach kind of gets, things can get weird when you get into the higher vibrational versions of Mirach. There's a lot going on. But anyways, moving on to the whatchamacallit, the Star Wars star, which I call Titawin. Titawin is the actual thigh of Andromeda, and it is a kind of a I don't know, it's kind of a weird style. It's a I don't really even know how to like properly begin to explain this star, but when it comes to I don't even know why I'm like undoing my pen, but yeah. So Titawin is a like it's the like I said, it's the thigh of Andromeda. It's the right thigh of Andromeda. It's a very it's a powerful star, but it's kind of like the lower natures of Alpheratz, where it's all about philosophizing about what could be. But it's not necessarily like philosophizing about what could be. It's about like philosophizing about like everything that I said the Kuí Sù stars should be doing, because the third house are the ones that are always thinking about um, what's going on like in their own mentality, but they don't do anything about it. Titawin is all about like titty twisting. It's all about figuring out what they need to do to like they're basically all about figuring out like what they need to do to get like past whatever they're stuck on. So whatever they're procrastinating in terms of what's holding them back, they spend so much time thinking about the proper tools, the proper therapies, the proper protocols and practices to expand beyond like what's going on. Like they're all about trying to figure out how to heal themselves and getting so lost into the study and the philosophization of what it means to heal themselves that they don't ever get around to it. You know what I'm saying? So it's like goddamn, come on, man. Like you can spend so much time like studying and being in the lab and like figuring out what you need to do, but you're never working on it. Like what's going on? Like it's just a weird thing. And as we kind of like dive into all of these different stars and really like what's going on, you'll recognize that each star is a different and deeper perspective on Andromeda as a whole. And it's kind of like as one, it's like as above, so below type thing, where they just focus on specific different perspectives of the same vibration. So in this case, like Titawin is all about focusing on how, why, and when they can figure out how to heal themselves and yet not doing it, right? So, and all things considered, like I would say, like this is one of the best procrastinators, because by the time they actually try, and by the time they decide to heal themselves, and by the time they commit to it, they're going to have a whole host of therapies in their back pocket to be like, hey, man, let's figure this out. And this kind of comes back to the energy of 9, because this star is moving into the ninth degree of Taurus. It's at 9 degrees of Taurus. It's at 9 degrees 10 minutes of Taurus, and like I said, it's the right thigh. It's a very powerful star. It's a good star. I think it's a slept-on star in terms of the Andromeda constellation, because Andromeda people only know Almach, Mirach, Alpheratz, and then Vertex. Vertex is kind of like more of the accumulations of Alpheratz, if I would say. It's like it's basically like a spheroidal, like mini spiral galaxy that spins above Andromeda's head. I was gonna put that in the honorable mentions, but we'll talk about that later. But anyways, let's get to Almach, right? So Almach is it's a oh man, it's just that, man. It's all man. You know what I'm saying? So basically, Almach is an energy of Mars, Jupiter, as well as Venus, right? It is the right calf of the Andromeda constellation. Oh, I gotta pop my ears. I'm talking so much. And you can find it at 14 degrees and 36 minutes of Taurus. 36, 35, it really depends. But basically, Almach, I like to think of it as like either in a nice way, it's like a child when you pick them up. It's like you pick them up and their legs keep going and they're still rustling. And or it's kind of like picking up a dog or like a bunny rabbit that's just like, "Man, put me down, you know? Like it's basically what it is. That's how I kind of understand and explain that energy. So Almach is a funny motherfucker because it's you can basically like see it right here, you know. Look, chained woman. Arms are chained, but she can still kick. You know what I'm saying? So that's that energy of Almach at the end of the day, of where it's like you have so much gumption, you have so much motivation, you have so much ability to convey ideas that you want to do, and yet you're still held back, you know? So the thing about this star is like they feel so held back that they will literally manifest a physical situation. And when I say they and like they feel someone who's like influenced by this actual star, this is specifically for someone that has it on their moon sign, like the specific degree on their moon sign. For those of you that are about to go check your degrees and you're checking the degrees off I named, remember the stars move 1 degree every 72 years. So if you're born in like 1930, Almach would be at like damn near 12 degrees. It would be in like the late 12 degrees of Taurus, right? The stars move. Don't fuck that up. So when it comes to Almach and feeling like that, basically what I was saying is they feel the need to be motivated and do a lot of things, yet they construct these things to hold them back to the point that they manifest something physical to hold them back. And they kind of go through this trial and tribulation of like, I'm so excited to do this, but now my schedule doesn't permit it. And it's just like, dude, you like put this on your calendar and like you basically self-sabotage, and it's like they have to go through all of these trials and tribulations that they put themselves through to realize that it's some subconscious mechanism from way back when that's holding them back, right? Like it's like they become a successful investor, they do all this, they do all that, and then whole time they like moved out of country to dodge their student debt or whatever because of some weird law where it's just like if it's above or below a certain number, but you move out of a country, it'll get forgiven. But then they don't look at the time frame or the statute of limitations on that, and then they're a really good investor. They move back, and then they realize they have to have business in that country that they have that debt, and they like the investment that they had would basically get like absorbed by that debt that they have in that country, but they got a good business situation in that country. I know it's kind of a weird example, but that's basically the thing of the subconscious self-sabotaging that comes from Almach, right? But if you look at it in a more of a positive light, you can kind of see Almach like those little like Hot Wheels cars that like you would get on Christmas time and like your little stocking, you would pull them back and that would kind of like wind the spring, and then that would like launch them forward and they would go on their own, right? So in a more higher vibrational sense, you can look at Almach as that of where it's kind of like a slingshot of once they figure out whatever's holding them back, they'll be launching forward at twice the speed. So Almach, all things considered, is a pretty good star because it's like it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but in reverse of where it's 1 step back and then 2 steps forward. And you're just like, how can I start at -1? And then they're like the rate of acceleration makes them feel very successful. So Almach, at the end of the day, it is a benevolent star. It just has to get the right energy and motivation and relationships to actually push it in the right direction, or else that Mars, which is kind of a one of the harsher planets in our ecliptic, will hold them back in some way, shape, or form, instead of having those two great benefics of Venus and Jupiter pushing it forward, right? So it's kind of like more often than not, they're gonna have some bullshit to deal with, but the more likely energies that like gumption that energy will feel will attract a lot of attention, and usually the right partners because they're so dedicated on figuring out like what they want to do, but also ignoring what's holding them back and kind of being like, I don't want to deal with that. So it's like Giving a Taurus analogy, it's kind of like bullfighting, where it's like they're gonna feel like they feel very aggressive. They're excited to live their life, but they're still in that like arena, right? And all they have to do is literally push that energy towards the door to get out. That's kind of what it's like. But other than that, guys, that's pretty much all the stars. Some of the honorable mentions and some of the just like random after the fact stuff that we have going on can be talking about some of the extra stars, or if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them. And yeah. So yeah, drop some of the questions if you guys have any about the stars, or if you missed anything. And yeah, I mean that's pretty much it. But now I'm going to talk about some of the honorable mentions, which is Vertex. Vertex is not necessarily a part of the constellation, but it is like it sits above the Andromeda constellation, and it's kind of like sits behind it. So it's a powerful star. It's a powerful thing, and it's kind of like Alpheratz, but it's sort of like the accumulations. No, there's a it's not the vertex. It's like a spheroidal, like almost like mini spiral galaxy that like from the perspective of where we're at, it sits like above Andromeda's head, but it's really like a couple million of them light years behind. So yeah, so basically, vertex is like the accumulations of it's seen as the accumulations of all the thoughts that Andromeda's had throughout all the eons of her existence. And it is like it's powerful, it gives a lot of opportunities, it creates a lot of spaces, it does a lot of things, but it is the symbolizing of like what I would say, especially if you're influenced by it, of the karma that someone experiences when they have too many thoughts on their mind and too many things holding them back. You know what I'm saying? That's kind of like what vertex is. Nah, I mean, we went over this. Your vertex is like it's kind of like you're hitting gifts, and it's like more vertex like isn't an actual thing. In that terms of the chart, like this is like talking about it, seeing it from a fixed star perspective, but it's kind of like a mathematical calculation similar to like your lot of fortune, your nodes. It's always a moon calculation. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, it's like two different things. There's the fixed star vertex, and then there is like your vertex, like hitting dips. Like I wouldn't say the accumulation of being chained up and held back, wondering what you'll ever be, is a hitting gift. I would call that karma. You know what I'm saying? And not even karma that was fun. Like you didn't even get to do some fun shit in real life. Like you just like held back. Like you were just like, oh man, all these woulda, coulda, shouldas gave me some bad karma. You know what I'm saying? Like that's vertex in a nutshell. Hmm. But yeah, you know what I'm saying? It's like if you called like if you for example, if you would call Almach like the woulda, coulda, shoulda, Almach would be the booger sugar that held you back from living your life and getting a good job. And then vertex on the top would be the woulda, coulda, shoulda. You know what I'm saying? So it's like you had your Almach booger sugar, you were running around, you were hyped for a short amount of time. And then all that stuff that you could have done went to your vertex. So it's like that's literally like the as above, so below of like what could have been. But yeah, I mean that's pretty much Andromeda. Like I said, for everybody that's new, like live, and then if you have any questions about Andromeda and what's going on with it, let me know. I'll hang around for a little bit and call it like the afterthoughts and the after experience. Oh, wow, perfect. That was my entire laptop battery. I plug this in. I was ready. Oh damn, it's not even working. Come on. All right, well that kind of cuts things short. Um, Yeah, it doesn't seem like anybody's got questions. All right, well, you can find me on the gram if you got them, or comment them in the future.